Thank you very much. Allow me to thank my friends of San Patrignano yet again for allowing me to come and present the bank and the activity of our bank, especially in the sector which is called social credit. Genetically, in other words, the social impact that our bank has, especially our bank. For us, it is very much very important, more important than for other banks, because our bank, as you know, has as part of its bylaws the fact that its activity is addressed to sustaining social activities, supporting non-profit organizations and private and public organizations that work in this field. This is not the first time I'm talking here about our bank's activities. In 2014, for example, I talked about social bonds. And this year, I'm very pleased to talk about these again. The social bonds are, in fact, bond emissions. In fact, bonds are not very popular with the public, to a certain extent unjustifiedly. But in fact, bonds can finance activities, and the bank, in fact, will give some of the profits they get from the bond to certain social activities. The first bonds issued helped to finance San Patrignano projects. The first to extend the hotel, which in fact the hotel or the lodgings, and they were able to add many rooms. And then the other one was a health center, which is recognized. Then the next thing was crowdfunding. We have set up an electronic platform which is completely free. This is done by the bank, and one can post projects which are proposed to the community to achieve crowdfunding with small donations. This year, I'd like to tell you about the idea of financing family debt. In other words, helping the understanding of the situation of over-indebtedness, and thereby to help offload some of the family's debt, and ways of doing it which are not very well publicized. Now, this phenomenon is very marked for companies and, in fact, not so much for families when they're in debt. For companies, if they're in debt, there are many measures that can be taken. There are restructuring plans. There, in fact, can be a bankruptcy agreement with easy terms. But for families, if they are over indebted, there's very little help, and they're not known. What we call agreement with creditors, liquidation of the assets available, and so on. So families very often are literally left to fend for themselves if they're over indebted. And this has led to very many dramatic situations. For example, in the paper in Rimini, there was the story of a person who, in fact, got into the hands of usurers because he tried to get out of debt. Now, why would the bank propose this sort of help to families? Now, what is known as the creditors' agreement is, in fact, a sort of bankruptcy agreement, which, from a business point of view, is an agreement with the indebted company with the various creditors. And this is possible for the families. It is, if you like, a small bankruptcy agreement, and helps the family to get out of debt. In our particular case, the family can put what it has and then have its debt resolved. Again, it's always an agreement with the available resources a family has, and it also is something which is legally binding in the sense that it is agreed by a court, and again, it wipes out the debt. The player who is very often a better if he gets into debt is considered as a consumer by the legal system, and somebody who, a gambler if you like, has got into debt could be helped in this way. I talk about the gamblers because, in fact, gambling today is a very dramatic thing. About 30 or 40 million people bet, it is estimated, and 1.5 million people, in fact, have a pathology with regard to betting. The other day, I was in a bar in Bologna having a coffee, and in fact, I saw on a poster that somebody had made a big winning, but then again in the newspaper there was a story saying that students are gamblers, and more than 10% of all students can be considered frequent players, and many of these students play at or gamble at more than 1 or 3 games, and many of them have a pathology when it's not controllable. Now, San Patrignano, in fact, is also engaged in this pathology, and they have a center at Nuovo Feltria where they help psychologically people to leave their gambling. Now, again, as I say, gambling is all important, but then another important phenomenon is the family that has to go to a usurer to gets even more into debt. So what is done to help these people? In 2015, the bank was active in renegotiating of mortgages. In other words, if a mortgage is at 5 years at a certain interest rate, if that was acceptable several years ago, it's no longer acceptable today. One has to extend the terms and the length of the mortgage today. And we have been able to do this. 400 people, mortgages, in fact, approached the bank, and we were able to extend or suspend the installments for a certain amount of time. If the family was not able to pay the installment and it was suspended. Not always are the families completely destitute. Sometimes the families have to make a certain number of priorities, pay other debts rather than their mortgage installment. And if a bank can, in fact, put off payment of the installment, of course it helps the family, but it also means that the family can pay other suppliers. And then again, what the bank is doing also is helping families where the breadwinner has lost his or her job. And you know that the state gives a unemployment allowance, but not always is it paid immediately. So the bank tries to step in the interval. What are we planning to do in the 2016? We want to allow the families to have access to this release of debt, and we have two obstacles. The lack of information. The families don't know of this facility. They don't know that they can use this, and they don't know how it works. And then there's the economic difficulty of getting this going, because families who are in economic difficulties, in fact, can't pay the professional and legal bills to present a plan in to the courts with regard to extending and their debt. So what's the bank doing to try and help the families and get over these two hurdles? The first is to organize centers of help desks. Now, for example, at San Patrignano, this is what they do when, for example, they opened up that center to help people who are gamblers, or non-profit organizations that can help here. With the police officer, for example, we have developed a series of help desks. And also we have galvanized professional people that give their consultancy, economic and legal consultancy. And of course, the help desk has to be supported by experts.
That's why, or that's how we're able to verify this. And then, of course, we have to establish a cost profile. How are we going to be able to forecast the legal assistant cost and what we will need to get aid and expert in the economic aspects involved? Well, through all of the professional guilds that exist, where they look at the tariffs and the prices. There's a professional assistance that can be used, and that they will reduce their costs to assist. They work together for the purposes of spreading, let's call it spreading, of helping those in economic difficulties. And then there is pre-deduction bank loans. Find a bank that believes that this is going to be positive, and then feels willing to bring forth this funding. And then there's crowdfunding. That's the third possible solution. It's a straight grants, we call it management crowdfunding. So crowdfunding, where we're trying to handle a project. So we take the project, and then we have a cost, and we see if the project has been achieved. Now, crowdfunding is not used for managing an activity, but it could be used, however, to finance and to refinance the thresholds that we have, that we made available, the crowdfund that has been made available to assist the families for the purposes of beginning the project. In the first quarter of 2016, we sent 25,000 euros as a threshold for a fund that other public bodies could establish to fund the family's access to these procedures. And then, of course, there's microcredit for starting over again. So a family, a citizen, once the individual has been able to pay off his or her debt, then he or she will need to start a new economic activity, and for that purpose, we will need microcredit to restart. I'd like to just conclude on this with a few comments to say that the collaboration with San Patrignano in microcredit and the bank's collaboration therein is not something that is just for financing, for economical viability. A microcredit is something that is broken down into three things. So the microcredit for the restart. So the first thing is an identification of the business projects that might exist. So what we try to do is verify in a given economic context and in a given geographical sector if an economic initiative might actually be successful. Then, and an example, we're working with San Patrignano. That's a good example of this. The second is starting off and undertaking training programs. So the creation of an entrepreneurial training program in collaboration with the University of Bocconi in Milan. San Patrignano is doing that, these entrepreneurial occupational training programs. Then there is the funding of the business project. So that's the third aspect. We have a few examples of that, but rather than going through all of those examples, I do want to conclude by just pointing out a fact, really, something that we've done over the course of the last few days. A proposal was made to us for the financing of the starting of an economic project for a young man who is here in San Patrignano, who's going back to his hometown in Veneto and would like to pick up his weaving activities. So was made a request for financing from our bank. Our bank is analyzing the request, and I am very pleased to say that we are willing to assist him, and it's a proud example of us, of what we can do as a bank, as a company, but how we can continue to target interesting projects, all the while giving profit back to our shareholders. So here we have a chance to use products that can assist those who need the most assistance, the most vulnerable. And so on that note, I should like to thank you for your attention and wish you the best in the continuation of your work.